RT's very own Afshin Rattansi joins me to talk about events in Kazakhstan. Afshin, thank you for giving up your downtime.
Thank you for inviting me.
You work all the time here, and now you're joining me when you're relaxing at home. I'm grateful. The events in Kazakhstan could alternately be seen as embittered and unequal citizens of Kazakhstan, a post-Soviet state ruled by an oligarchy with grossly unequal distribution of wealth, not just between rich and poor, but between north and south and different sectors of the community. Or it could be what the Kazakh government say it is, a regime change operation launched by the West, or it could be both. Where do you stand?
It could be both. And you started the show off, as you often do, with the number of audiences that Moat's, mother of all talk shows, goes out to in the United States, but to the global south. So I suppose for your American audience, who may be wondering, why should we even be bothered about Kazakhstan? It is, of course, because it threatens world stability. It also, again, addressing the American audience of this show, if some of those listening or watching are amongst those 40 million who cannot eat tonight without federal aid, they may be wondering why there were jobs in Kazakhstan, courtesy of the National Endowment for Democracy. People watching can see the banner here. There are lots of jobs recently. $50,000 for International Bureau of Human Rights that the U.S. taxpayer, U.S. public money was going to, democratic ideas and values. What were all these National Endowment for Democracy jobs paid for by the U.S. public money going for to Kazakhstan in recent years? What was Tony Blair, who I know I call him Sir Tony Blair, unlike you, of course, was advising the dictator of Kazakhstan? What exactly is this story about? Because now all we hear about is how evil Kazakhstan is. The dichotomy you asked me about in this question is central. And I think what we see here, based on the evidence so far, is, again, we have a developing world leader, Pacha, Gaddafi, Assad, who cozied up to the West, and the West have double-crossed him. And therefore, we have to be very, very worried about what may lie in store for Kazakhstan.
Although Russia and Armenia and Belarusia and the other members of the CSTO, they acted so quickly and so powerfully. I wouldn't, if this was a regime change operation, my betting is that for now it's failed. The problem will be if they have a Syria scenario in mind, if they're going to fund terrorism on a slow burn in this most combustible of areas. Do you think that might be what they've got in mind?
I mean, again and again, isn't it? Since, in fact, the 20th anniversary of 9/11 last year, more and more commentators came out of the woodwork saying they know very little in the State Department. Antony Blinken, famous for his support of the Libyan catastrophe on the Mediterranean, if they are going to try the ISIS-Daesh model again, and people who are surprised to learn that the United States and Britain and NATO were supporting ISIS-Daesh and al-Qaeda in Syria, there's lots of it on the internet, and lots of, I think, peer-reviewed political papers now that demonstrate that. You're right, George. Obviously, China and Russia border Kazakhstan. They're not going to be hoodwinked again the way they were over Libya, especially given how important Kazakhstan is to Russia and to China. And the idea, maybe somewhere in the vaults of the State Department or at Langley at the CIA, that they can hit Ukraine this week, because let's not forget they're meeting in Geneva today. This week's a big week, meeting in Vienna, the Organization of Security and Council in Europe. Big meetings this week where Blinken and Stoltenberg of NATO are going to threaten Russia with, well, if some of the briefings are to be believed today, all-out war, World War III, if they think they can do that on one flank and Kazakhstan on the eastern flank, I don't think Beijing and Moscow are going to have any of it.
No, that's right. I mean, they tried in the first 48 hours to question the right of the CSTO partners to intervene in this way, when in fact it's not a right but an obligation, a treaty obligation, rather like NATO has treaty obligations of joint cooperation and defense. Then they tried to say China will not be happy about Russia and Armenia and Belarus going in there, until China said we're very happy with it. We have as much to lose from instability on the Eurasian plain than Russia does. So if they are going to achieve it, it's going to have to be through the Islamist path. Now, several of the Kazakh policemen have already been beheaded. The government of Kazakhstan at least claims that many of those arrested are Arabic speakers, in other words, have come in, perhaps from Syria, through these Central Asian republics, and have entered Kazakhstan as part of a carefully planned operation. What say you?
Yeah, these movements have been occurring. I mean, look at the conflict in Azerbaijan, Armenia last year, where there were reports, credible reports, that there were Islamists previously backed, presumably from London and Washington, entering Azerbaijan to fight with Armenia. We are relying on Kazakh authorities for the beheadings, and one has to say, condolences from, I'm sure, from both of us for the reported more than 160 dead, and let alone fears of the genuine working classes of Kazakhstan who've been demonstrating against the elites, whose money, actually, of the Kazakh authorities is probably here in London.
It's probably here in London.
People, it's all the money's over here. Surprising you don't. I mean, of course, if money really talks, there may be elite interests who are worried as well about Antony Blinken and Joe Biden thinking they can start this war and employ ISIS, Daesh in this way, thus destabilizing financial interests. But you mentioned earlier about Beijing and Moscow. I mean, already, if you're going to watch NATO nation media, the state-mandated British Broadcasting Corporation here, or, you know, read The Economist magazine or something, immediately it is, oh, well, this is terrible for Moscow-Beijing relations. I think, I'm sure
they
you
know
laughed when you
better.
started.
They know better now. But that's why your comparison with Gaddafi and others was so apposite, because as it happens, and I know this personally, as it happens, over the last couple of years, the regime and the oligarchs in Kazakhstan have been trying to distance themselves from Russia and cozy up further to the West. As you say, much of their money and property and their visits to the bordellos and the casinos and so on is already here. The oligarchy is a big customer of the West, so far as banking and luxury goods and so on is concerned. So just like Gaddafi made a turn to the West, and then the West literally stabbed him in the back, that's what would appear now to have happened to the Kazakh rulers.
Yeah, these elite interests in global South countries, in developing nation countries, they never seem to learn, do they? But of course, it poses a difficulty. We know the way that Beijing always likes to say it will never interfere in the political processes. So the real working classes of Kazakhstan are going to get no help from Beijing. And Moscow is going to just try and restore order and then maybe leave them to it, rather like in Belarus. So given the gross human rights violations of the Kazakh regime, again, how do the ordinary Kazakh people get through their being used as proxies, being hijacked by Islamist causes so beloved of NATO? It's a terrible time for the Kazakh, 20 million Kazakh population. Let's hope at least this will completely put a stop to any neoliberal processes that were being started by the elites in Kazakhstan.
That's exactly why they increased the petrol price, albeit from a very low 13 cents a litre to 32 cents a litre for LPG. but they were doing that to please the World Bank and the IMF and the dictates of those who say that we can only support free market economies. And Kazakhstan better stop all these subsidies and public ownership of various services and institutions.
And it goes even further, doesn't it? Yugoslavia. I mean, we saw when bin Laden's friends were trading in Bosnia. I mean, this is the playbook, as we know, along with the National Endowment for Democracy. And Beijing is even more aware, obviously, because of the Uyghur situation that will again be flooding the headlines for the Winter Olympics in a few weeks' time, all the so-called human rights abuses. I'm not happy about this shoot-to-kill policy by the Kazakh government. But what does Antony Blinken think, or Joe Biden think, happens in Guantanamo Bay, where they torture people and where the world seems to have forgotten about? What gives the right of Washington to talk about human rights, or NATO countries with their black sites to ever talk about human rights in Kazakhstan, given their record of, and of course you alluded to this earlier, because of Britain and Sir Keir Starmer honouring Sir Tony Blair, tens of millions wounded, killed or displaced. There is no right by Jens Stoltenberg or any leader that supported these wars to talk about human rights in Kazakhstan, let alone in Xinjiang, let alone, of course, in Russia.
Afshin Rattansi, thank you for helping us, and I've no doubt there will be calls on this matter. Stay tuned. Afshin Rattansi of Going Underground on RT.